iLearn's opening day keynote. Today, we are very proud to have Dr. Shawna Pandya as our opening keynote. I have had the pleasure to know Dr. Shawna Pandya for some months now, and we consider her a member of the XR Women community, of which I am one of the founders. So Dr. Pandya is a scientist-astronaut candidate with Project Possum. She's a physician, she's an aquanaut, a martial artist, an advanced diver, skydiver, a pilot in training, and she's the vice president of Immersive Medicine with Luxsonic Technologies, as well as a fellow of the Explorers Club. She's also a director of the International Institute of Astronautical Sciences Space Medicine Group, Possum Space Medicine Group. She holds degrees in neuroscience, space, medicine, and a certification in entrepreneurship. And she's currently completing a fellowship in wilderness medicine. She was granted an honorary fellowship in extreme and wilderness medicine by the World Extreme Medicine Organization in 2021 and was one of 50 physicians selected to attend the 2021 European Space Agency Space Medicine Physician Training Course. Dr. Pandya was named one of the Women's Executive Network's top 100 most powerful women in Canada in 2021 and a Canadian Space Agency Space Ambassador also in 2021. So Dr. Pandya was part of the first crew to test a commercial spacesuit in zero gravity in 2015. She earned her aquanaut designation during the 2019 Neptune mission. I'll let her explain what that means. And she previously served as a commander during a 2020 tour at the Mars Desert Research Station. Her expeditions there were captured in the Land Rover short and released with Apollo 11 First Steps film. She previously interned at ESA's European Astronaut Center and NASA's Johnson Space Center. She has published on a diverse range of topics, including space spinoffs for medical benefit, psychological resilience in long-duration spaceflight, and reproduction and sexuality in long-duration spaceflight. So I think I could go on talking about Dr. Pandya for a very long time, but I don't want to take up too much more time away from her speech today, and I know you will be fascinated by what she has to say. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Shawna Pandya.
Thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction, Karen. It is my extreme pleasure to be here today. I see the comments are already coming in through the chat, so please keep them coming. Happy to do questions at the end. So first of all, can everyone see these slides okay and hear me okay? Just feel free to reply in the chat. Perfect, okay, awesome. So we are here to talk about space medicine and how immersive fits into all of that. So before we go any further, let's start with a question. And my question to you is, when you're looking at the International Space Station and a remote village in the middle of nowhere and a medical Arctic climate, as well as the Aquarius Reef Base, one of the world's only underwater habitats, what do all of these environments have in common? Well, that's a question I want you to keep in mind because we are going to get to that. So as Karen told you in my introduction, I have gotten to wear a lot of cool hats in my time. I've been lucky enough to, as Karen told you, be the VP of Immersive Medicine with Luxsonic Technologies. I am also a clinician in women's health, ER, and I am also a scientist-astronaut with Project Possum, which I think you will come to understand throughout this presentation. An exploration world is full of acronyms. Possum is yet another one. The Possum stands for Polar Suborbital Science of the Upper Mesosphere. And here is an example of some of the work that we've done. So we've basically conducted climate science in high altitude unpressurized aircraft in northern Alberta. So in Canada, where I'm from, we've tested spacesuits with the Canadian Space Agency. So this white spacesuit you see is called an EVA spacesuit, another acronym. Stands for extravehicular activity spacesuit. So this is the kind that you would see in Apollo moon landings or spacewalks outside the ISS, International Space Station. We've tested another kind of spacesuit called the intravehicular or activity or IVA spacesuit in water landing simulations. I learned the hard way that you really have to pull all the seals in your suit unless you want to swim around with water into it. Do not recommend. And I've been lucky enough to test this IVA spacesuit in zero gravity in parabolic flight. And I can tell you what that's like, but I would rather show you. So I'm just going to play a quick video here and let me know if you want the volume adjusted.
Cover all the tasks so that I can record it. No rain in the back, no rain in the back. Umbrella. So Anna, I will just put this word back.
I would say that for me the hardest part was as much as you know your roles, as much as you've practiced all the parabola sequences on the ground, once you're pressurized and once you're in zero G, the maneuverability becomes that much harder. For one of the parabolas, the busy board interface that I was trying to practice my sequences on was slightly off kilter, so that kind of made it a challenge. And then just trying to fight with your own physiology.
To have a giant smile on your face. And so my adventures have taken me to a whole host of ice, or what we called isolated and confined extreme environments as well. And so in addition to zero G and partial G, I've also, as you heard, been a commander at the Mars Desert Research Station in the Utah desert. So this is real life on fake Mars. I'll just center that image for you a bit. And basically, you're living and working with your crew as if you were on Mars. So if you're going outside your habitat here, you really do have to suit up, lest the atmosphere kill you, for lack of a better word. Some of the other austere environments I've been to have included underwater. So do you guys see the slides advancing? So I've also been to aquanautics missions. This was at the Jewel Undersea Lodge over a 5-day underwater mission called the Neptune mission. So like I said, lots.
Look at the top of the screen and there's a refresh button at the top right.
We will
try to hit that and see if that will work for you.
For letting me know about that.
So individually, that should work for you individually.
Should have reloaded, and now we're going to advance to the underwater habitat that I was telling you about, so you don't have to actually imagine. So are you seeing the Mars and the underwater slides now? No. Okay, for some reason. Not sure what's going on here. It's advancing for me, so I'm a little bit flummoxed as to what's going on.
Yeah. Well, you know, one option would be to quickly save it as a PDF. Oh, so some people are scrolling. I see. Okay, they're able to scroll themselves. Well,
So
that's a
here,
way then for people to sort of self-guide them through as you speak. Is that okay with everyone? Yeah, shall we go with that then?
oh gosh, sorry to make you work for this presentation. Okay, so come join me underwater on slide 12. And so this is the Nautical Experiments in Physiology, Technology, and Underwater Experiments. Aquanautics Mission stands for Neptune. And here's an example of another austere environment, the Aquarius Reef Base, also known as NEMO, which stands for NASA Extreme Environment Missions Operations, where NASA sends its astronauts for crews for stays of 8 to 16. And again, to practice living in this resource-limited environment, as well as practice crew dynamics. And so then the question, which begs the question, why do austere environments matter? And this being an immersive conference, where does XR fit in anyways? So we're at slide 17 now. Let's start with a thought experiment, because if you want to understand the why of why austere environments on Earth matter and why space matters, then you also need to understand the challenges of space and the hazards to human health that the environment brings, as well as the constraints. So on this thought experiment, imagine you're heading to Mars. My question is, what will you pack with you? So let's talk about the challenges of the spaceflight environment. If you remember nothing else from this section, it's that space is trying to kill you. And so when we talk about the challenges of the space environment, we talk about everything from altered day-night cycles. So if you are on the International Space Station, you are experiencing a sunrise-sunset cycle every 90 minutes. That's 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets for a 24-hour period. As well as increased radiation, acceleration, deceleration loads, being in confined spaces. So no one wants to be that guy or gal who's voted off the space station because they don't get along with their team. When we talk about day-night cycles on the moon, it's 14 days of day and 14 of night. And then, of course, there's the obvious one that everyone thinks about, which is, of course, microgravity. Or zero G, as colloquially known. And the thing to know about microgravity is that every single bodily system, whether we're talking about our bones or our muscles or fluids, or even our brains and spines, are affected by the zero G environment. In addition to that, the further out we go, the more radiation becomes a consideration. So for those who are scrolling along with me, we're over on slide 22. And as we get outside the protective confines of Earth's Van Allen belt, so the International Space Station is 400 kilometers, about 250 miles above Earth's surface. As we go farther to the moon and beyond, we have to contend with higher energy radiation, which poses a threat to pretty much every bodily system, from our eyes to our blood-forming organs, to our skin and hair as well. There's also the challenges of time delay. So for those of you who are Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fans, there's that quote that says, "Space is big." Space is vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big, so big that you wouldn't believe it. And so what that translates to is that even going at the speed of light, we can only go so fast. So if we're talking about a Mars mission, depending on the alignment of Earth and Mars, you can expect a 6 to 46 minute round trip delay. So now imagine that you contend with an emergency on Mars. You don't have time to wait for help from Earth. And then there's everything else that we talk about, which falls under the umbrella of hostile environments. So for example, when we talk about returning to the moon, we talk about increased threats from lunar dust. We have hundreds and not thousands of pages of documentation from the Apollo era, which suggests that lunar dust was an irritant to our lungs and skin, as well as it clogged up the joints of spacesuit as well. So when we talk about the challenges of the spaceflight environment, we summarize that down to the big five. Basically, altered gravity, distance from Earth, isolation, confinement, everything else which follows under hostile environments, and of course the radiation threat. So again, to summarize, space is hard, space is expensive, space is trying to kill us. So the second part of this question of how do we pack for space? First of all, we talked about the challenges of the spaceflight environment, but we also need to know what are constraints. Every kilogram that we bring with us is at some sort of financial cost. And also our spaceship is only so big. So whatever we bring with us has to abide by the constraints of mass, volume, power, cost. It also has to be easy to use and have a long shelf life. So for those of you who are hikers out there, NASA calls this the backpacking principle. And so if you're going on a hike, everything that you bring with you is at the expense of something else. So I like to call this backpacking principle the Aladdin principle because it's infinite cosmic power to get to space, but itty bitty living space. And so knowing these challenges, how do we pack for space? Well, this isn't just a theoretical question. When we look at the NASA roadmap, as well as the international community's roadmap for sending humans to space, it's a lot more ambitious than just the International Space Station. So as of 2019, NASA has announced its plan to advance with the Artemis missions. And so this is a plan to put the first woman as well as the next man on the moon by 2024. And the idea, you feel free to applaud that because I'm pretty excited about that as well. And so the idea is to both establish permanent surface operations on the moon, as well as use the moon as a testing ground for Mars and beyond. So remember, on Mars, we can be delayed by up to 46 minutes when it comes to communication with Earth, and transport back can be as much as 9 months. So that's why it makes sense to use the moon as a testing bed, which is only, in quotation marks, 3 to 5 days away and a 2.4 second communication delay. All right. So as you can imagine, it's not just the big five that we have to worry about anymore. So for those of you who are following along on the slide, hop over to slide 33 and you'll see that we've expanded from just 5 hazards when it comes to human spaceflight to a whole laundry list called the NASA Human Research Roadmap of Risks to Human Health that include everything from crew dynamics to radiation to dust to things that are intuitive, but we may not remember to name, like human-computer interfaces. So you can have the best technology in the world, but if your crew doesn't interface with it well, then it's not going to help you on your mission. There's skills deterioration as well. So imagine that you're the crew medical officer and you learn how to put an IV on Earth, and then you don't practice that skill till you get to Mars 9 months later. Well, your poor patient's going to look like a pincushion. So that's why it matters that we identify the risks ahead of time as well as knowing our constraints. If this sounds really challenging and somewhat demoralizing, I challenge you to flip this question around and say, well, what if we didn't just provide the standard of care when it comes to space and austere environments, but what if we surpassed it? So this is a very roundabout way of coming to say, this being an immersive conference, how do we engage with immersive technologies such as VR, AR, and 360 video to help humans survive and thrive in austere environments? So for those of you following along, this slide on 36 is borrowed from our friends at Oculus. And basically, when we talk about the abilities of VR, we're talking about risk mitigation, being able to practice in high stakes scenarios with minimal risk, building that muscle memory over repetition, doing so in a collaborative fashion, and also engaging in deep resource utilization, decrease physical space utilization, and cost savings as well. We also have data to suggest that when we look at how immersive applies to learning, learners have shown to have faster retention, faster learning time, their user confidence, 3 times, up to 4 times more emotional connection to the learning material, better retention, and of course, increased cost saving. So this is exactly why we look at immersive technologies for space, but also austere environments. So you can see here on slide 38, this is an example of the HoloLens in use for just-in-time training at Aquarius Reefs, where at the NASA runs the NEMO mission. And even as recently as in the past few months, the NASA Neutral Buoyancy Lab for using augmented reality for underwater simulated EVA operations in the dive tank. And I particularly love this slide here on slide 38 because this is astronaut Johnny Kim in action. And for those of you who don't know his bio, he's a Harvard-trained physician and astronaut, as well as former Navy SEAL. So anytime I think that I may have done enough with my life, I just remember Dr. Kim's bio. So hopefully it's starting to make sense of why VR, AR, and immersive has made it to space and is continuing to be utilized for astronaut training, as well as in situ operations on the ISS and beyond. So let's come back to that roadmap when we talk about the hazards of exploration class missions, meaning human spaceflight missions to the moon and beyond. So what if we could mitigate risk? If we could provide that crew medical officer with a way to upkeep those IV insertion skills while respecting the challenges of the resource constrained environment, of the mass constraints, of the power constraints. Well, let me take you through what we're working on with my position at Luxsonic Technologies and how we're working to make healthcare for austere environment, space, and otherwise. So our mandate, we call ourselves an unapologetic do-gooders. We're very Canadian in that way. We talk about implementing immersive technologies to improve medical education, training, healthcare delivery, as well as accessibility. So this is our caregiver VR system. It is a virtual reality-based platform for hands-on medical education, training, and assessment designed to be integrated with an ACMS, again, space levels acronyms, and that stands for Advanced Crew Medical System. So the goal of this project, this was funded by the Canadian Space Agency, and it was to develop a TRL, Technology Readiness Level 6 prototype for exactly that, VR-based skills practicing, assessment, and training, with the idea of utilizing this for exploration class missions. And just to give you an idea, TRLs, technology readiness levels, exist from 1 to 9, 9 being space ready, 1 being something you might have conceptualized on the back of a bar napkin. And here, I'll load this video. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. It'll take us to a separate video about one of our medical scenarios on a moonwalk gone wrong. So let's load this up here. Hopefully you can see it.
Warning.
Loading for you.
Warning. Warning.
Perfect. All right, let's hit the
Suit breach detected. EVA-1.
EVA-1, this is EVA-2. Come in.
Approach waypoint.
Acknowledged. EVA-1, this is EVA-2. Come in. Mike! Mike!
Retrieve patch kit.
Stay with me, buddy. It looks like you have a suit breach. I'm on it.
Secure patch. Return to base.
Oh, that was close, bud. Let's get you back to base to get you checked out.
Oh, good. You're up. That was a close one. How do you feel? You had a suit breach, but we got you patched up in time. I'm just going to give you a once-over from head to toe now to make sure you're okay. We're going to start by putting some monitors on you, make sure that your O2 sats have recovered. You got down to 85% out there.
So I'm going to mute the volume now so I can explain to you kind of what the learner would get out of this. So
Heart rate
if you're a
looks pretty
crew
good,
medical officer
78
for
beats per
exploration
minute.
class mission, you actually have the ability to practice physical
Now we're going to do
exam
a quick
skills,
head
for
and neck
example,
exam.
applying monitors,
Just want to see what
doing
your
an
pupils are
assessment.
doing.
So in this particular scenario where you're worried about trauma as well as
Right
decompression
eye,
based
3
on
millimeters,
the
reactive to
EVA,
light.
the nature of the EVA injury.
Left
You
eye,
can actually
3
perform a
millimeters,
head-to-toe exam and
reactive to
utilize
light.
your
Pupils are
virtual
3
pen
millimeters and
lights
equal and
to
reactive to light.
do a head and neck exam. You have your otoscope, which
I'm just
you
going to
must,
take
I
a look
guess,
at your tympanic membranes
I will
now.
pick up in a
With that kind
second.
of decompression, you're
And
at risk of a
look in my
eardrum
patient's
injury.
tympanic membrane, make sure there's no evidence of a decompression
Well,
injury.
you got off pretty lucky
So
this
there we
time.
go.
Tympanic membrane is intact, no signs of perforation. Any pain here?
And it's crazy. My aha moment while being in caregiver was when I was
Just
first
going to have a look inside
playing
your
around, and I was
mouth, look
putting
at the buccal
the
mucosa, looks
stethoscope on my
okay.
patient's
Pharynx,
heart.
hypopharynx look
And then I just
okay.
had this aha moment where I
Next,
realized
we're going to do a
how
quick
immersed in the
chest and
scenario I was, because I
cardiovascular
was
exam.
treating my
Have a quick listen to
virtual
the air
astronaut
entry, make sure
buddy
there's
as a
no
patient, and it wasn't
signs of
virtual
a
anymore. It was,
pneumothorax.
I'm
Air entry is
really
pretty
invested
good
in this.
on the
And
left,
so there,
and the right air
it's
entry is equal bilaterally.
it's hard to explain until you are in VR. I'm doing a medical assessment, but it was just crazy
Normal
listening to
S1,
the
S2 sounds,
stethoscope and
heart rate
realizing
is
that
regular,
it's no different from
no
clinic or
murmurs. Sounds pretty good.
from the ER.
You're
So I won't take you
surviving
through the
so
whole
far.
scenario because we have more to talk about today. Let's go back to the slides here. So the idea with this is we can provide a standard of medical training and practice to keep an astronaut crew healthy and a medical crew officer sharp, even if they're as far as the moon, even if they're 6 to 9 months away from Earth. So let's get back on track with the slides here. Probably still not advancing, is it, Hey?
Some people are saying that they are still hearing the audio from the video playing.
Oh,
I don't
no.
know if there's something. Yes, sorry.
Oh, gosh. I'm not sure. It stopped now. Okay,
Great.
perfect.
Good,
There must
good,
be
good,
some
good
sort
news.
of delay.
Yes.
These are the kinds of delays we expect on Mars, but good to practice on Earth too, I guess. All right, so for those of you who are following along on the slide, we are now over to slide 48. So this is the value of immersive. It can help prepare us when we're in austere environments where we may not have the creature comforts of being able to do the standard head-to-toe assessment and apply all the monitors you would in a trauma bay. Switching over to other examples of immersives we're working on. So we also use 360 video for teaching skills to learners. And basically, I hope you're starting to have those wheels and turning in your head and make that connection. Like, hey, where does that volume, low mass, low cost, easy to use, long shelf life, could that make sense to use? Where else could we benefit from using things that make a technology that increases our retention, decreases costs, reduces risk, increases collaboration? So I promised you an answer to a question that I asked you at the beginning of this talk. So I asked you, why do austere environments matter? And I'm going to answer that with a question that I asked right before that. And that was, what do the International Space Station, a remote village in the middle of nowhere, and an Arctic medical deployment, and the Aquarius Reef Base have in common? And what do they have in common with the fact that the world population distribution is 44% rural? And what does this have in common with life during a pandemic? And the answer is, these are all examples of resource limited, in some cases remote, and isolated and confined environments. Life in a pandemic is an austere environment, and we have seen this time and time again with medical learners losing access to their traditional learning spaces, their traditional hands-on learning labs, and their typical skills, their physical places in which they learn skills. So let's come back to another question we asked earlier. What if we didn't just provide the standard of care when it comes to education and medical care? What if we surpassed it. And what if we didn't keep those benefits for space, but what if we brought them back to other austere and resource limited environments on Earth? So we're doing exactly that. So I showed you the space version of Caregiver, but I'd like to take you now through a VR example of, an airway module of our Caregiver platform for paramedics. So I hope it'll load, yeah, that you should be seeing this come up. Let me know if you can't see it and we'll do something about that. So here you can see that a paramedic is encountering a patient. They have to clear the floor. And then figure out how to manage an airway as they would in real life. So imagine that the first time, imagine that you could mitigate the risk of something as critical as an airway patient by having your learner encounter and practice airway management before they ever got into a real life airway management scenario. So we also have modules for medical laboratory technician, and we have more in development in addition to the ones we've shown you. I know we're getting to the end of our time here today, so there's a couple more things I want to show you and a few more questions I want to answer before we get to the questions. I'm going to leap on over to slide 50, maybe a little bit beyond that. If you're following along on the slide, come over to slide 60. So knowing the power of VR and of immersive to overcome a lot of hurdles when it comes to resource limitedness, here's another question that we've asked at Luxsonic is, what if we could optimize radiology in the same way? What if we could provide folks who have lost their traditional radiology reading rooms through COVID, or who never had the physical space or resources for that setup, knowing it can cost 30,000 US per square foot for simply the physical space and the radiology setup. So this is our Sievert module. This is a virtual reality radiology reading room and a headset. So this is currently available for any radiologist, medical learners to collaborate on. And this will be my second to last video. But this is what it looks like when you virtualize the radiology reading room. So we'll just maximize this so it's easier to see. Here you'll see our CMO as well as one of our advisors, both practicing radiologists. So Alves is our CMO, Woojin Kim is one of our advisors, and basically they are meeting in totally different dates in a virtual radiology reading room to review the imaging of a fracture patient. So I'm just going to bring the audio so you can see what that looks like. Oh gosh, you guys aren't seeing the video at all. Stop playing it. But basically, I think there must be a lag between what I'm seeing, what I'm playing on my end versus what's coming through. So I do apologize about that. But basically, in this collaborative space, you can have radiologists in different countries even reviewing imaging of a patient. So why does that matter? So we focused on Earth for the time being. Think about bringing medical students back into some of their learning spaces that they've lost with COVID. Think about being able to sit with the radiologist and review imaging. Think about being able to consult a colleague, even though you may be in physically different areas, and review the imaging together. And then, because we started this talk in an out of this world place, let's go back to the extreme environment. So, in the final minutes here today, let's see what else we can do with radiology in those underwater and microgravity environments. So for those of you who are following along on the slides, hop on over to slide D3 and D4. So coming back to the Neptune mission, this is exactly what we did. So on this mission, I was the crew medical officer. I brought an Oculus headset underwater with me. I donned the suit, the headset, and activated the Sievert headset, and actually liaised with the head of radiology in Saskatoon, Canada. Remember, I was in the Florida Keys, 20 feet underwater, with the head of radiology 1,000 kilometers away to review the shoulder or scapular fracture of a simulated trauma patient. So even in these quote unquote resource limited environments, you can still access the resources that you may not have previously had access to. This was kind of a wild week because not more than 6 days later, we actually took the Sievert suite on a parabolic flight in microgravity. So this is what you're seeing on slide 64 and 66. And if you click on the video here on slide 66, you can see my colleague Heidi donning the Oculus headset, and you can hear me asking Heidi what she thinks. Let me bring this, oh, not what I play here. So basically, I'm asking her how it's going, and she's giving me a thumbs up. So whether you're talking about developing immersive for austere environments in space and bringing those benefits to Earth with VR hands-on training and skills practice, or if you're talking about developing VR solutions for radiology on Earth and bringing those to space-like and austere environments, it's a spin-in and spin-off technology benefit. In the last few minutes here today, I want to come back to some questions we've asked about, we asked earlier when we talked about austere environments. So perhaps the most critical question, rather than asking why austere environments, why immersive in austere environments, and what do all of these environments have in common? I think we've talked about that. So let's end with a one-word question: is why do this at all? When you have access to solutions that are lightweight, accessible, mitigate risk, provide collaborative environments, and result in cost savings, well, why not bring them to space to push the limit? And why not bring those benefits back to Earth? So that's all I have. Thank you so much for your attention. I do apologize for the tech difficulties, but hopefully you can also been able to follow along, and happy to take any questions in kit discussion right now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shawna. Let's all hit F4 and give her a well-deserved round of applause. Really fascinating talk. Yes, please put your questions in the chat and we will pass them along. And if you don't mind, I'd like to just make a comment, and maybe you would have some response to this. But I love the way that you are able to make these connections between these environments that are so vastly different. And, you know, we may sort of have this idea of space and virtual reality being associated with one another because they're futuristic, right? But in fact, it's more about the concept of you being in a particular location and what that means in terms of your connection with other people. I love that you can make those connections in your work.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. And it really, like, sometimes you just have these aha moments. And for me, it really was that stethoscope on my virtual patient's chest, and it's like, holy cow! Like, this is treating. I'm treating this like I'm looking for a equal air entry on a patient I would see in the ER. And it really is a way of bringing that connection back.
Really, really fascinating. So what other questions do we have? Okay, here's one from Jonathan Richter. So he wants to know, what kinds of emotional connections do you find are most important for helping people to be healthy in isolated, austere environments?
Well, that's a great question. So I've actually written a book chapter about psychological resilience in long duration flight and austere environments. And
Cool.
so what we know is that there are certain people, some people may say a submarine for months, no thanks. Our Antarctica for months, no thank you. How could that possibly be fun? And then there's people who actually adopt what we call a salutogenic approach. So that's a psychological term for viewing this as, a positive opportunity for growth, rising to the occasion. And it's an important question to ask about how do you maintain positive connections and crew dynamics in austerity? Because I would argue that in COVID-19, in this era, that we're all kind of living in an environment, and knowing the facets of resilience and what can lead to positive interactions is critical. And there's actually research that says that there's very definitive traits, including positive talk, relying on our social support networks. And not only that, it's not an innate trait. It's not that Karen's more resilient than I am, and I'm just not resilient enough. But it's something that we can actually build up through practice.
Yeah, fascinating. So we have another question. What is the main difference between real experience and virtual experience in your work?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So this comes back to, what do you need to stimulate versus what can you leave out? And so it was really instructive for me because when I was first developing a clinical scenario, and then I take this back to the CTO and our dev team, the CTO would say, okay, but do we need this? And it's an important question to ask, like, how what steps are critical to include versus what are just going to add time to your training that don't add much. And so things like donning PPE, maintaining adequate hand hygiene are critical and are included in the scenario. But for example, hunting around for instruments in the ER isn't, and those are provided for you. And so it's always kind of a push-pull, and of course there's the realities of what will also take more dev time. But that's kind of how we approached it. Is I would provide the clinical expertise, and then my CTO, who's great and who has both healthcare as well as tech expertise, would help me translate that into dev speak.
Wow, really interesting. Yes, and Justin Chow wants to know, what kind of nausea results in virtual training for space, or from virtual training for space, I suppose, especially since you're simulating zero gravity, and how do you mitigate these effects but still induce realistic scenarios?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, anytime you're going into microgravity, you're at risk for developing nausea and vomiting regardless. And even when you go to space, it can take up to 72 hours to adapt to that mismatch between your eyes have to believe they're seeing and what your inner ear is perceiving. So with the trial that we ran with my colleague Heidi, that you may have seen on near the end there, she was actually able to tolerate it quite well. She's a very seasoned flyer, so there is some protection with having repeated exposure to microgravity, but it's something to, so it didn't come up during our trials, but it is something to be very aware of. And this is a little bit off topic, but still, I think it answers the question. Is we also have very strict protocols for looking out for the health and safety of our flight participants. And so we plan ahead of time of when we're going to call a knock it off or abort a parabola to stop the microgravity to readjust and make sure everyone's healthy and safe.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And Yulian Radu wants to know, how about the reverse? Can VR be used to train for space sickness vomit comet? So that's an interesting question, Julian.
That's a really good question. And it's a little bit tricky because some of the images you saw, so when you saw Johnny Kim underwater at the neutral buoyancy facility, they are simulating microgravity through buoyancy. But at the end of the day, your inner ear isn't confused because there's still a 1G pull in the pool. And then when you saw that image of me in the white spacesuit at the Canadian Space Agency, that was actually in a gravity offset harness. And so that just means I was able to offload my weight and to simulate zero gravity or lunar gravity. And so now imagine pairing a headset with that. So you can mimic the reality of the spaceflight environment, but there are limitations because in that environment you're still feeling the 1G pull on your inner ear. So you're unlikely to develop nausea and vomiting to confuse your brain and eyes and inner ear. I would strongly suspect on a parabolic flight, especially if you're not a seasoned flyer or you are prone to motion sickness, you could very well be prone to nausea and vomiting on a zero G flight. If you're talking about creating a VR module in parabolic flight to decrease the risk of space motion sickness in space, I don't think you'd be able to simulate long enough periods of zero G in a parabolic flight. So it's a very interesting question, but I don't think you could reverse engineer it.
Interesting, yeah. So, folks, there is a raise hand button next to the chat here if anyone would like to ask another question. But I wanted to sort of address this idea that VR equipment can be more portable and affordable than other, say, large labs, for example. And so that it does offer the opportunity in at least certain contexts to actually not just meet, but exceed the standard of care or the current standard of care, to go beyond it. Can you say a little bit more about that in terms of the opportunities that VR has to offer?
Yeah, sure. So, so for those of you who are able to access videos, you can see that we could simulate everything from a trauma bay on the moon to an alleyway with a downed patient who is down from goodness knows what, to a full-on lab where you can practice pipetting skills, to a radiology suite. And so you can create whole new worlds that you don't have to travel to, that you don't have to buy every single pipette and microscope for. And you know, we've definitely looked into the numbers for example, the Sievert suite, and you know, in the U.S., if you're only factoring in physical space and the capital costs of the setup of the multiple high resolution monitors, you know, the ergonomic desk and chair, and you're not even factoring admin, it's still tens of thousands, up to $30,000 per square foot. So there, you know, the cost savings, I know sometimes we see those who aren't versed with immersive medicine saying, well, it's, you know, the headsets are expensive. Upfront, yeah, they can be, but when you look at the numbers of, you know, doing radiology in VR versus radiology in real life, it makes a lot more sense financially to pursue a virtual reality radiology reading room.
Yes, of course. And that's, whoops, I'm just going off the stage here. Let me turn around and come back. Yes, and that's one of the things that is so fascinating about this technology that we are all working with here, the possibilities that it creates for so many new things, and some that we can't quite imagine yet. So really a lot of scope for innovation. What do you see as the most exciting thing to come in terms of immersive technology in general or immersive medicine specifically?
Yeah, so immersive medicine, I think it's just, there's so much potential. And I think just, doing something that would traditionally be high risk, like in medicine right now, the first time you operate on a patient is the first time you operate on a patient. I'm sure it's terrifying to some that, like we all have to start somewhere. But that means someone will have to be someone's first patient under a scalpel, which I think may be uneasy for some. So you can imagine mitigating that risk by, performing your first appendectomy or intubation in VR. So these are high risk, high stakes scenarios. And I think to me, the thing that's most exciting is, um, bringing that accessibility to people who may not be able to practice intubation because of lack of resources, as well as mitigating that risk.
Yeah, it's a pretty frightening thought to be the first person someone has ever operated on, and I can imagine that their nervousness would be a factor in the potential for something to go wrong, and so the opportunity to practice is extremely valuable.
Absolutely.
What other questions do we have? Any more from the audience? And so what's next for you, Shawna? Is your next adventure?
Oh gosh, every day is like a box of medical chocolates. There's always new project opportunities. I really look forward to getting back into the spacesuit once COVID lets us, getting back into zero G. We've been on hold, understandably, because of COVID. I'm working on all manner of space medicine, both on the commercial side, on the research side, on the mentorship side. So it's kind of crazy to think that there's all these dreams you had as a kid about building cool technology and being an astronaut. Actually, you can do as an adult, but in a way that surpasses what you imagined you could do as a kid. So the ultimate dream, obviously, is to get to actually go to space. But everything I do right now is related to space and space medicine. So it's a pretty fun, if not chaotic life.
Yes, yes. Well, yeah, and I share your excitement about XR and immersive technologies, and I think a lot of my colleagues will say the same thing, that they love what they are doing, and it's just such an exciting field to be in, no matter what area of it you're working on. You have a role model, a woman who was a role model for you. Can you tell us a little bit about her and how she inspired you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're referring to Dr. Roberta Bondar. So she, for those of you who don't know, she was Canada's first female astronaut. And so I grew up in the 90s when she was selected and then flew in space. And so that was, really inspiring for me. And it's probably a good lesson as to why representation matters, because I looked at her and I said, okay, she's an astronaut. But she's also Canadian. I'm Canadian. She's female. I'm female. She was a girl guide. I'm a girl guide. So now all I have to do is be a neuroscientist physician, and then that means I can be an astronaut. And that's literally what inspired me to go into neuroscience in my undergraduate degree, and then in medicine, and then pursue space as a career. And it was really, really wild in 2019 being honored in a permanently featured exhibit in Canada's largest science center, in an exhibit honoring women in space. And so there's this permanent feature at the Ontario Science Centre, which has Dr. Bonder and then myself and then a space. So this is exactly what I mean about a representation mattering, but also, you know, having these crazy dreams as a kid and then surpassing them in ways you never thought possible as an adult.
That is so awesome. Really amazing. And you are, of course, very inspiring. Okay, so we have very little time left. So I'm going to ask both of the questions that are in the chat, and we'll have to cut them off after that and let you, I'll let you decide what you want to answer and how you want to answer them both, because we just have 3 minutes left. So these questions are you planning on simulations to prepare people for psychological challenges or other emergencies that could occur on a space station, a hostile nation shooting a hole in the space station window like the show For All Mankind? Second question, what do you think? If we finish training in VR, can we go to work in the real work directly, or must we have an experience or training in the real world again? That's very interesting. And third, there is so much growth in immersive medicine these days from so many companies. Do you see a need to share these simulations across different companies? Do you see a future where it will be much easier to access and create such content, similar to how the internet allows us to access information? So speaker's choice, Dr. Pandya.
We will treat this as a lightning round. Okay, so first question, Diane, that's a great question. My personal view is no guns in space. That's a bad idea. You know, psychological simulations are already ongoing. Even when I was at the Mars Desert Research Station, even when I was on the Neptune mission, we're always simulating, because the idea of simulations is you want to mitigate risk. So these are being done, and the more done, the more we can retire risk, the better. So the question is, if we finish training in VR, can we go to real work directly? Everything we do is in a graded fashion. So, you know, we are always trying to level up in life. So once we, you know the basics of intubation, okay, now let's do it on a very high body mass index patient. Now let's do it on a patient with a very short neck and a very difficult dentition, as well as a full-on beard to make it super challenging, boss level. So we're always trying to level up, whether we're doing this in VR or in real life. And that's just to make sure that we're as safe as possible for our patients. And then last but not least, so much growth in immersive medicine. Do we see a need to share these simulations? Yeah, at the end of the day, it's all about accessibility. It's about, like I said, being an unapologetic do-gooder. And the idea is, you know, bringing access where there was none before. And however we can do that through partnerships, you know, with the public sector, with NGOs, with other companies, we're happy to talk about doing good.
Fantastic. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pandya, for sharing your time and expertise and experience with us today. Everyone here in the audience, if you could just hit F4 to give a round of applause, to thank our speaker. We really enjoyed this conversation. And with that, I will bring the main event to a close here. We are going to stick around for a few minutes, at least I will. I hope you can, at least for a few minutes, Dr. Pandya. There's also a dance party in the Haptics Lounge for those of you who would like to join us there. But the live stream will now close. So thank you again to our videographers, Tony Cube Studio, and to the YouTube audience.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all.